As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm seated with Paul, a very serious man, Tanya, and Ian. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Great Conversation. But before that, we got a question. Was this from YouTube? We got this question from YouTube. And this is what it asks. The person says that they are preparing for their homeschool journey. They left a very kind and positive comment, but then they asked this question. My question pertains to extracurricular activities. Dun, dun, dun. I feel confident in the quality of my children's future education using Memoria Press's classical core curriculum. However, I'm finding the world of extracurricular activities to be overwhelming. Between sports, art, music, dance, etc., I am struggling between my desire to have well-rounded children and not wanting them to get overloaded with activities. Do you all have any advice on how to strategically place our children in extra activities, and how many is too many?
I think it becomes too many when it's interfering with your family life. I think you've got to get your schoolwork done. And then I don't see anything wrong with limiting the number of activities that each child does. The problem is if you've got 4 children on 4 different soccer teams, you're just going to be gone all the time. And that's just, that's a stage of life.
Sure.
Is you become a taxi. But extracurricular activities are good, especially art and PE kind of activities, physical activities and music. It's all important, but you do have to limit or they can take over. And if they really start, like if you're just stressed all the time because your family's never together at home, in the solace of your home, then it's time to cut back, I would say.
Sure. We, at this table, you're the only seasoned parent. The rest of us are more seasoned educators, perhaps, than seasoned parents. But speaking from an educational perspective, Martin Cothran gave me a book called Range that he really liked, and I really liked it as well. And the book basically talks about 2 approaches to education, one being specifying and getting really deep into a particular discipline. And so the example there is Tiger Woods was golfing when he was like 4. Or trying to be a generalist. And so Roger Federer is the example. He did a lot of different things. And then he became, both of them were great in their sports, but one of them was a notably better human being than the other. And that person being a generalist. And throughout the book kind of argues for the ways that being a generalist can be a really helpful way to move through life. So I think from the perspective of education, the desire to have your students be well-rounded is a good one on a basic level.
It's just
a good one. The balance is the issue.
But if you, and I haven't read Range, but if you don't, like if you have an interest that is just the all-encompassing interest, if you don't then spend a lot of time on that one thing, if you want to be a gymnast at the Olympics, then you're going to have to not be a generalist. Sure. You're going to it just depends on what your goal is. How many, though, of our children are really going to be able to get there?
Yeah.
But I do think extracurricular activities, especially sports, are really good for instilling discipline and learning how to lose well.
How to work on a team.
Yes, how to work on a team. All of those things are good in moderation.
Paul, when you're talking to online academy families, they're asking this kind of question. Any advice that you give?
Well, we have both kinds of families. Some that are, doing ballet for 30 hours a week, right? But you have others that are saying, well, we're gonna, maybe we'll let each child choose an extracurricular, but it's one extracurricular.
Right.
Right. But the parent may not see piano lessons once a week or twice a week as an extracurricular, right? That's just something we do that's part of our academics, right? Like we're trying to teach you fine arts. And, now if you're going to take that piano to a level where you're going to be doing that 2 hours a day, then that's your extracurricular, right? But if it's just something where we are trying to get you that generalist education, then that may not be seen as extracurricular. What might be seen more as an extracurricular is that sports team or the horseback riding or whatever it is.
That's right. I would never, and my children would never have considered their music lessons to be extracurricular.
Sure.
They were, because they had to work at it. They had to study just like you would study at an academic course. So that is a good distinction to make, is piano lessons versus being on a t-ball team.
Sure.
Or, we do, fine arts should be part of our core. And we're working on making it more the core, as we work with Carol Reynolds and hopefully try to increase the offerings that we have for fine arts education.
And I think kind of what I tend to see is families when their kids are young, because your t-ball may be twice a week, right? One practice, one game, right? And so when their kids are young, they get involved in several different things. But then as those children get older, each one of those things takes more time because they're that older version of whatever that thing is supposed to be now at a higher level. So you have to put more practice into it or more time into it. And so it's sort of a normal thing where the kids get involved young, and then you have to start saying, okay, we're cutting that out because we don't have time.
Like a traveling soccer team,
right.
They're like they travel all the time now. These traveling teams. I think when I was young, we didn't have traveling teams. You were either on the school team or not. Now there's a lot of extra things that homeschoolers can do. A lot of teams they can be on.
Right. And there's some people that choose to homeschool precisely because they're on one of those teams.
Yes,
right?
because they want the flexibility to be able to do that because it's really important to them.
Yep.
I'm not sure we've helped at all.
I think we've brought a couple of distinctions that might be helpful. But I think, it's helpful every year to sort of reevaluate
the use of your time.
The use of our time. So then that way you don't put yourself in a position where all of a sudden you're so overloaded that you got to say, we got to cut things now. Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think those are some helpful points. Transitioning to our topic for today, we're going to talk about the great conversation. So a couple of weeks back, we talked about the liberal arts, but if you look at our mission statement, what Memoria Press is trying to do is encourage homeschool families and schools that are giving a classical education that instills virtue and wisdom through an education in the liberal arts and the great conversation. So this topic is the great conversation. First, that phrase, I think someone used the word specious before we sat down. That phrase is a bit specious.
It was Ian.
What do we mean by the great conversation? Paul, tease that out for me. What exactly?
Make it less specious for Ian.
I don't think I know what the word specious means.
It's appropriate.
So I think I'm going to assert that the great conversation is synonymous with the great books, because once you get involved in the world of books, you realize that books really are responses to other books, right? They're not just out there, they're not the guy out on the corner just shouting to the wind, but they are responding to somebody else who wrote a book. So all of that is in the books that have stood the test of time. It's a huge conversation, right? And I think by great, we mean not only large, but it is also of weighty importance, right? And so by using the term great conversation, we're saying humanity's been having a dialogue about the foundational ideas of what it means to be human ever since, the first written word. And so we want our students participating in that, not just being bystanders and soaking up the thoughts of the day, but really understanding the depth of that conversation or in that dialogue, and then hopefully then assimilating the best of that conversation and then jumping in and participating from here on out.
Do you think the great conversation is more than just the great books, or are those synonymous terms?
Tanya has thoughts. I'm going to let
I
her
do,
jump
because
in.
I think, the great conversation starts very young. And I don't know that I would say that Heidi is one of the great books,
That's a
but
great
I think
point.
we
Yeah.
can certainly have meaningful, enriching conversations based on the themes in a book like Heidi. So I do think we
about ideas that are universal and go
universal.
back to early questions
Yes.
that Plato and
Humility,
Aristotle were asking.
nature
Yeah.
versus the city.
Okay, I'll
True
get behind
friendship.
that.
We,
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I do think that is do we want to call that the great conversation? I think it is the great conversation. It's just on a 4th grade level
Yeah.
or a 5th grade level.
So, Ian, what are some of the other themes that have kind of resounded in the great conversation that pop up in a book like Heidi or in Shakespeare?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got friendship in something like Heidi. I just recently read through it myself. You've got that idea of true friendship. I think justice is always a part of the great conversation. I mean, I think if we could just say it plainly, any of the virtues, the cardinal virtues or the theological virtues, those are themes that we're going to see pop up over and over and over again. And sometimes it's in a silly way in a Shakespeare play, love, just the wildness of love or the silliness of love, but at the same time it can be very profound in a Shakespeare play. What love is, what justice is. I mean, you read something like King Lear and you have a deep sense of an injustice that occurs and the sacrifice that occurs because of it and the tragedy of it all, so you participate in those ongoing conversations.
I think maybe to go more sort of foundationally there, right? The question is, what is the good and what does it mean to be good?
Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
And that takes manifestations of those different virtues.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, to go back to Plato and Aristotle, right? We're fundamentally, we're asking questions about the good life,
Mm.
right? And that is sort of determining how we see ourselves, where we see ourselves flourishing, where we see ourselves reaching our full potential. And it's in those virtues.
Yeah.
But there's moral virtues, there's intellectual virtues, there's a whole slew of things. So, a book on philosophy is going to be part of that great conversation. A literary book is going to be part of that great conversation. And so far as it's incarnating those virtues into a story, a book on theology is going to be part of that, as well as we're trying to hash out, okay, now what's our relationship to God? What can we know about God and He who is goodness itself, right? So all of that, I think.
And also lessons in pain and suffering.
Mm.
Not just virtue, but what do we do with pain and suffering?
And what's the virtuous response to pain and suffering?
And what is the virtuous response? That's right. And I think the perfect example is, I don't know if you all have read The Door in the Wall, but it is on a 5th or 6th grade level. And it teaches that, through pain and suffering, we can still have full, purposeful lives.
Yeah.
Paul, I want to go back to you said that kind of the great conversation is how do we live a virtuous life, or at least that's a central question. It made me think, in a conversation, there's usually a question that starts the conversation. Another question that maybe started the conversation is, what does it mean to be human? But the question, what does it mean to, flourish, is kind of a different take on that. What other questions do we think are in contention? If we were saying these are a few of the questions we think maybe were the first question, what other questions would they be?
I mean, I think the question of purpose, what are we here for? What is it? What are we honoring, dishonoring? What is our end goal, our telos, if you want to use a word like that?
Well, and I think, in part of that conversation, right, as that conversation evolves, then people start saying, well, is there an end goal?
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is something that would come up at a high school level, right?
Yes.
Obviously, we're going to start with that assumption in younger years,
We're
right?
not going to ask the 3rd grader, is there an end goal?
Right.
No, I think Ian's absolutely right. I mean, purpose. You're really talking about being. Okay, so what you said, what does it mean to be human? And I think you're talking about doing, right? I mean, those are your two things. Like, so what does it mean to, what is the human and what does the human do? And those are sort of the foundation, but then I don't know that we have expressed kind of what I'm getting at is if that's the trunk, right? You've got all these branches and shoots going off.
It's a tree. It's huge.
And you could look at a book and go, well, that's not part of the Great Conversation. And in fact, it is, because it's off on this branch, and it's a branch of a branch of a branch that fundamentally is still coming back and asking that same question.
And we're teaching students to understand how things they encounter relate to that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So Tanya, on that point, you've mentioned a few ways that literature helps our even younger students kind of engage with the Great Conversation. Are there other subjects or ways that our curriculum brings young students into contact with the Great Conversation?
Well, the obvious first leap would be classical studies, those famous men books, because they're hinged on characters, good characters, bad characters, virtuous characters, evil characters. And so it just continues. It's the same. It's not so as much thematic,
Sure.
but it is certainly teaching a set of ethics and how to be a leader, how to be a good leader. What is a good leader?
Right.
Mistakes that people have made. So that would be for the young students the next obvious thing, and obviously Christian studies.
Sure.
I feel like that speaks for itself, but I thought I should mention it that the Bible has all of those stories. When people call us and ask us how we deal with the betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere to King Arthur in the book and how they talk to their students about it, I always say, how do you talk to them about David and Bathsheba?
That's right.
And Uriah? Right. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same themes over and over and over, and you can find all of them in the Bible.
Yeah. So in any other ways that you think that our students are brought in contact with the Great Conversation?
Well, I think even in I think that's kind of who we are, is everything points towards that, just like we were talking about in the Christian studies episode, everything points towards being Christian. So I think even from a technical side, anytime you are learning a language, Latin, going on to learn something like Greek, you are able then to participate in an even deeper way. So it's all preparation. It's preparation to be able to go on and read Caesar, to read Virgil, not just in English, but in Latin, those kinds of things. Yes,
learning Latin for the sake of learning Latin.
That's right.
Or to be able to read those original translations. And science, the study of nature, actually recognizing the miraculous.
There's an order to nature.
Yeah, an order and beauty and also ugliness.
Yeah.
I mean, nature's hard too.
I like how our middle school science books are kind of written from the perspective. I'm thinking of Tree's book specifically, of an old school natural philosopher who's a peripatetic, almost a modern day peripatetic, walking around just taking notes on the ways they see the world, and that's a part of the conversation. The Great Conversation started by Aristotle. What is around us, and how do we describe it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Tanya mentioned the famous men books. I think history as well, and to include the comment on science, there are ideas that are being proposed in science through books, through conferences, whatever, actually affect history, right? And so to reduce history to, and we mentioned this in the Christian Studies podcast, but to reduce history to just names and dates and not realize that there are ideas here that are affecting what's happening. And so it's important to bring all of that together, right? And so we look at, we can be participating in that Great Conversation by learning the history, by learning, the effects that these ideas have, Galileo, right? I mean, it's a scientific thing that there have been wars fought over Galileo, but significant disagreements and arguments over that. But it's a scientific idea, right? They published in a book.
Yeah. So coming back, Paul, you kind of started in a literary direction and talked about the Great Conversation as kind of the pinging back and forth of ideas between authors. I wanted to ask you three if you could think of examples of where a idea in the Great Conversation was talked about by one author and then picked up again later by another author. So like one example is kind of the philosophy 101 example is Descartes. He's musing about the fact that he doubts, and realizing he doubts, he says, I think, therefore I am. But why is he even considering this question of what it means to be? It's because he's meditating on prior philosophers who are trying to describe what being is, right? So that's just a reaction to a lot of philosophical writing that had come before. Paul, can you think of other examples where that is just a clear part of the great conversation that we are preparing our students to step into?
Well, I don't know why, because I don't know this book terribly well, but the book that comes to mind is Moby Dick, right? So he writes this in a time where the oil industry, right, the whale blubber industry, they're going around and so and killing a bunch of whales and harvesting what they've got, right? But he's writing about that issue, but he's contextualizing it with regards to man's relationship to the world, right? Which is what many, many figures before him are talking about, right? So you've got the romantics that are bringing in and saying, well, actually, if man would just stop harming nature, nature would be good, right? And then you've got Herman Melville who comes along and says, well, I mean, yeah, man gets killed by nature, and nature is bigger than us, and so he's a part of that conversation, but he's making it bigger than just the story of Ahab going after the white whale. The
romantic notion that the nature is this wonderful, peaceful place of bliss is challenged by a killer white whale.
Yeah. And I say all of that trepidatiously. I feel like Kyle needs to come in here and talk about it.
But I think you're illustrating that's part of the joy of a classical education is starting to see that Moby Dick isn't just a story about a whale. It's also an interaction with Wordsworth and the things that were being written just prior to Melville. Any other examples that y'all can think of?
I mean, I think you just the curriculum itself, our curriculum structures this, especially once you get into the middle and high school years, when you begin with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and then you move on to the Divine Comedy and you do it in that order. Because you have the story of the Iliad, the fall of Troy, and you're dealing with questions of heroism, of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a fighter, what it means to fight for what you love, friendship, all of these things are there. The gods, how do the supernatural things come to play? And then you've got the Odyssey, which picks up with Odysseus after the fall of Troy. But then you have in the Aeneid a Roman, someone who is many centuries later than Homer. Virgil is writing the Roman epic. And he's trying to place his people in the person of Aeneas and say that all of everything that defines us comes from this great tradition that the Greeks handed off to us. All that heroism, all that struggle, all of that faithfulness, fidelity, etc., is bound up in the person of Aeneas, and that's our forefather, and that's who we are. And then you've got, Dante coming many centuries later and writing his epic, the Divine Comedy, where he uses Virgil to get him so far, if you will. And I don't want to give a lot of things away because you just need to read this. You need to pick this up and read it. And then says, no, but actually Christianity comes alongside these other things and takes us where these others couldn't, and picks up, we end at a certain spot and only God then himself can take us further.
Yeah. It reminds me of, and then, some of the Lancelot tales begin with tracing the lineage back to
That's right.
The Iliad, Odyssey.
That's right.
Because what are they doing? They're trying to do the same thing, root those Lancelot traditions in this broader conversation. Tanya, anything come to mind for you?
I can't get it in my head. I just recently read something with an author who is a contemporary author and said that Dickens, I was really interested in, because it wasn't obvious, the influence that Dickens had on his or her life, but I cannot remember who who it is or what I read.
There's probably so many
But-
modern novelists that are really dependent on Dickens and
Well, you
others
know,
like that.
I'm afraid there aren't.
There aren't enough.
Right. I don't think there are enough. I think that's a problem we have is that we do have a lot of contemporary authors who haven't studied those great authors who are still being published for a reason.
Well, and another example that came to mind, and this isn't a fully baked thought, so maybe y'all will help me bake it, but with Dumas and the Count of Monte Cristo, right? He's dealing with some very human issues of injustice and you know, is it revenge or is it justice, that sort of thing. But he's also writing that because his father was unjustly imprisoned as a general in Napoleon's army. And so he's like in that he's working out his own thoughts about what does this mean for me? And so because that great conversation is what does it mean to be human and how ought a human to act? Because these are humans trying to even work out their own thoughts on that. You know, they may be reacting specifically to somebody, or they may just be saying, in my life, this is how I've had to handle this.
I might not be able to help you bake it, but I'm going to put a little garnish on your idea and say that sometimes the great conversation, I think, elevates a work because it's consciously participating in the great conversation. So what comes to mind is Frankenstein. I think Frankenstein is not a good story. I've said this publicly on the show before. The monster learns how to speak by looking through a peephole at a family for a couple of weeks. That's a plot hole. I think we can all agree. But the idea of Frankenstein, the question of should we, just because we have the ability to do something with science and technology, should we? The romantic notions of the novel are obviously very powerful. And that's what's been so attractive to people for so long. Does that story hold up? I'll let the reader decide.
I think it's just so incredibly sad. That I really
Shane
struggle.
doesn't think Frankenstein's a good story? Is that what we're sad about?
I think the story itself, I just don't ever want to read it again. I found it very painful and it's so sad, like, you know, because he was such a, not Frankenstein, but the monster was such a victim. And the same thing with, is it King Kong?
I'm not sure.
There's some movie.
He hasn't read that classic.
Yeah.
All right.
But I think, if you're going for the monster as the victim, then
Isn't King Kong the same thing?
I think so,
where,
yes.
you know,
he's
it's
on an
just,
island. He's brought to New York. It's
Right.
kind of a spectacle.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I do think that possibly you could learn language by listening to a family speak.
Suspension of disbelief only goes so far for me in that after they, animated life from a pile of body parts with electricity, I was stretched, and then learning English through people, that was it.
You said
You really need to use your imagination more.
Yes.
Work on that. You know what it is?
It's that nonfiction that you read all
That's
the
what
time.
I was just getting ready
Books
to
of
say
information.
is you just need to read more fiction.
Well, I think one other thing too that we can talk about here, and I would like to use a modern example, a book that we all like, Amor Towles' Gentleman in Moscow. When we are talking about books participating in the great conversation, that doesn't mean that the book just alludes to these things, right?
Sure.
Like A Gentleman in Moscow alludes to so many great classical works, but what elevates, in my opinion, A Gentleman in Moscow into something like the great conversation is that he takes on those same themes more than just allusions. The book is about friendship. It's about family. It's about, and so he at the beginning, or at some point in Gentleman in Moscow, he quotes the beginning of Anna Karenina, which is the famous, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And then the rest of the story of the Gentleman in Moscow is about unhappiness and happiness achieved in family life. What becomes a family? What makes a family? So I think it's more than just an allusion to these things. It's an actual participation in taking up, even if you do allude, actually explicitly allude to a conversation. Your very themes, your characters, everything points towards.
Do you know what he's read? I listened to an interview with him, but I don't think they ever asked him what influenced him. What authors influenced him. I'd like to know.
Yeah.
I have to say that after all the hubbub that book has caused in this office,
You're getting ready to get kicked out of here.
No, I'm not actually. I was going to say that is the best defense. Everybody else has said, "Oh, it's so good, it's so good." Nobody has given me a defense like Ian just gave me of that book.
Have you read it?
Yes, I have.
And you didn't like it much?
No, it was fine. It was fine. But
it
again,
was fine.
This is the same conversation I had with the Lincoln Highway.
Frankenstein, so I want you guys to go after Paul right here.
I mean, same thing with the Lincoln Highway. Like, Martin comes in just raving about this book, like it's the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm like, it's a fine book, but I don't think it rises to the level of Anna Karenina. But to say that I need to place it in the great conversation for these reasons, okay, now I need to go back and reread the thing.
I think it could be on the same level as Anna Karenina.
Oh my goodness. My goodness.
Strong words.
Woo. Have you read it?
I have not read it. It's a modern piece of fiction. My wife has read it.
Mm-hmm. And loved it.
I'll maybe read it someday.
I love how you said it's a modern piece of fiction, as if like, of course I haven't read it because
like
it's a
it
modern
has
piece
a bad
of fiction.
taste. It leaves a bad taste in his mouth.
I love that, Shane.
So we've had this kind of wide-ranging conversation about the great conversation. And let me end it on this. Someone could hear this conversation and think that we're basically saying the great conversation is any topic that's relevant to a theme, like all education is doing this. What makes a classical education uniquely suited to help prepare our students to enter the great conversation and perhaps contribute to it?
I think number one, it's the classical education pairs that with the liberal arts, right? So if we've taught them the arts of language and thereby teaching them actually how to reason well, then that participation in the great conversation is not a participation based on emotions, but it's one based on rational thought that they've been trained in.
And I think it goes back to the same, we're reading Charlotte's Web in the third grade and we are having a conversation about it. But what's our goal? Our end goal is that then they will be able in high school to read Anna Karenina and to actually get the themes out of there that they need to get because we've prepared them for that. So it's not a book club. It truly is preparing them to read the best that was thought and said and be able not just to read it, but to discern. And that, you can't just pick those hard books up and do that if you haven't been prepared. Now, that doesn't mean you can't. I don't feel like I was prepared until college. I didn't read good things until college. So it doesn't mean you can't get there.
Right.
But I also read all those books with my children and as a teacher. And so I did start back there with those books and was able then to enrich my own personal life so that then I could read more difficult things. But it's a journey.
I think that while in other educations might make you intellectual enough to pick up on theme, to pick up on the conversation, and that's not to dismiss other educational systems, that those systems can still produce people who are virtuous and who want to participate in the virtues of the conversation. But I think one of the strengths of our program, of a classical Christian educational program, is that the virtue formation of the individual is so central to it that it's not just noticing themes, recognizing themes, it's actually wanting to participate in those themes and to take what's good and actually embody that, and take what's bad and actually not want to embody that.
That's right. And let those books actually change your life.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And I think we have to include math and science in that, and Latin. And, those subjects that really do train the mind. So they're like exercises for the mind.
That's right.
And so that's an important part of it too, even though we're not necessarily having a great conversation when we're studying Latin. But it is a preparation for us. It's all one thing. And just studying the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, I mean, they made all the mistakes. They did all the good things. So to learn from those things is really important.
Tanya,
Yes.
this has been a great conversation about the great conversation. I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it too, Shane. I wonder if Paul and Ian enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great.
I did.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.